My morning routine never changed in 20 years. Coffee at sunrise, boots on by 6, checking the cattle before the world woke up. The ranch stretched across 40 acres of Texas Hill Country, where my grandfather had raised cattle and my father had done the same. Our well had pumped crystal clear water since 1952, never failing, never causing trouble. I loved the silence out here. No traffic, no sirens, just the sound of wind through oak trees and cattle lowing in the distance. The water from our well tasted better than anything you could buy in stores. Cold, clean, with just enough minerals to make it perfect. Every morning I filled my coffee pot directly from the kitchen tap, knowing exactly where every drop came from. The suburban development had grown around us slowly over the past 5 years, where once we saw nothing but rolling hills, neat rows of identical houses now stretched toward the horizon. Heritage Hills, they called it. Each house sat on exactly 1/4 acre with perfectly manicured lawns and matching mailboxes. The HOA rules were strict, I heard from neighbors. No fence could be more than 6 feet tall. All houses had to be painted in approved colors. Even the trash cans had to match. Most of the new residents were friendly enough. They would wave when they drove past our gate, and some even stopped to admire the horses. Kids pressed their faces against our fence, excited to see real cattle up close. Parents apologized, but I never minded. It was good for city kids to see where their food actually came from. I had worked for the State Water Commission for 15 years, inspecting wells and water systems across 3 counties. People knew me as the guy with the ranch, not the guy who could shut down their water supply with a single report. I liked it that way. Work was work, but the ranch was home. The changes started small. New residents complained about the smell when we spread fertilizer. Someone called the county about our rooster crowing too early. A few people suggested we should trim the trees along our fence line because they dropped leaves into their yards. I tried to be neighborly, explaining that we had been here long before their houses existed, but I kept my tone friendly. Then the HOA started sending letters. They wanted us to join their association and follow their rules. They offered to help us improve our property value by removing some of the older structures and planting grass instead of keeping livestock areas. Each letter was polite but insistent. We were bringing down property values, they claimed. Our ranch was not compatible with their vision for the neighborhood. I threw those letters away. We were not part of their HOA and never would be. Our property had its own deed, its own rules, and its own history that went back 70 years. But I could see the tide turning. More complaints came in every month. More neighbors stopped waving when they drove past. The last peaceful morning I remember, I stood on my porch with that perfect cup of coffee, watching the sunrise paint the hills gold and orange. Cattle grazed peacefully in the pasture. Water flowed steadily from the well, just like it had for decades. I had no idea that within weeks, everything would change. I had no idea that one woman would try to destroy everything my family had built. I should have seen it coming. Margaret appeared at my gate on a Tuesday morning like a storm cloud in a clear sky. She drove a white BMW SUV that probably cost more than I made in 6 months. Perfect blonde hair, perfect makeup, perfect clothes that had never seen a day of actual work. She climbed out of her vehicle wearing high heels that were completely inappropriate for walking on gravel, but she marched toward me with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. "You must be the ranch owner," she said, not waiting for me to respond. "I am Margaret Patterson, president of the Heritage Hills Homeowners Association. We need to talk." I wiped my hands on my jeans and walked over to the fence. She stood with her arms crossed, tapping one perfectly manicured finger against her elbow. Her expression suggested she was dealing with a particularly slow child. I assume you received our letters, she continued. We have been more than patient, but your property is creating serious problems for our community. What kind of problems? I asked, keeping my voice level. Margaret pulled out her phone and started scrolling through photos. Noise pollution from your animals, unpleasant odors affecting property values, unsightly structures visible from the main road, dust from your vehicles creating air quality issues. Need I continue? I looked back at my ranch, trying to see it through her eyes. The barn needed a fresh coat of paint, sure. The chicken coop was functional but not fancy. The cattle were cattle doing what cattle do. But nothing was broken, nothing was dangerous, nothing was illegal. This property has been here for 70 years, I said. Every permit is current, every structure is legal. I am not part of your HOA. Margaret's smile turned sharp. That attitude is exactly the problem. You think you can do whatever you want without considering your neighbors. Well, times have changed. This is a family neighborhood now, not some rural wasteland. She got back in her BMW and drove away, but I could see her watching me in her rearview mirror. That was the beginning of the war I never wanted to fight. The complaints started immediately. Someone called the county about our fence height. Another complaint went to the city about noise ordinances. Margaret organized a phone tree, and suddenly every agency in the county knew about our problems. Health department inspectors showed up to investigate reports of standing water. There was no standing water. Fire department officials came to check our burn pile permits. Our permits were perfect. Environmental officials tested our soil because someone reported possible contamination. Our soil was cleaner than most residential areas. Every week brought new visitors with clipboards and official forms. Each inspection cost time and stress, even when we passed with flying colors. Margaret was systematic, working through every possible agency that might have jurisdiction over any aspect of ranch operations. The psychological pressure was constant. Margaret drove past our gate twice every day, slowing down to take photos with her phone. She recruited neighbors to her cause, organizing concerned citizen meetings at the HOA clubhouse. I heard from friendly neighbors that these meetings focused entirely on getting rid of the ranch. She calls you a public nuisance, my neighbor Tom told me. Says your property is holding back progress and development. She has charts and graphs about property values. Margaret's campaign grew more sophisticated. She created a Facebook group called Heritage Hills Safety Watch, where residents could report any problems caused by non-conforming properties. Every post featured photos of my ranch, usually taken from public roads but zoomed in to make normal ranch activities look suspicious or dangerous. The final straw came on a Friday evening. Margaret appeared at my gate again, this time with two other HOA board members as witnesses. She looked more confident than ever. I am giving you one last chance to be reasonable, she announced. Join the HOA voluntarily, agree to our improvement plan, and we can work together. Otherwise, I will be forced to take more serious action. What kind of action? I asked. Margaret smiled that cold smile again. Your water supply is completely unregulated. No telling what kind of contamination you are spreading to the neighborhood groundwater. I would hate to have to report a public health emergency, but if you force my hand. She left the threat hanging in the air as she walked back to her car. I stood there watching her taillights disappear, finally understanding that this woman was willing to go as far as necessary to get what she wanted. I just did not realize how far that would be. Sleep became impossible. Every night I lay awake wondering what Margaret would try next, what agency would show up tomorrow, what new crisis I would have to defend against. My wife started jumping every time a car pulled into our driveway. My teenage daughter asked if we were going to lose the ranch. The stress was eating our family alive. Margaret had turned harassment into an art form. She documented everything with the precision of a military operation. Photos of our fence, measurements of our setbacks, recordings of animal sounds, air quality readings she claimed to take near our property line. She built a case file that looked official and comprehensive, even though every single complaint was based on lies or misunderstandings. The county zoning office knew me by name now. I spent entire afternoons in their waiting room, defending against accusations that changed every week. One day we were violating livestock density rules. The next week we were operating a commercial business without proper permits. Then we were creating erosion problems with our cattle paths. Every accusation required paperwork, inspections, and responses. Every response cost time I should have been spending on ranch work. Feed bills went unpaid while I sat in government offices. Cattle vaccinations were delayed while I researched obscure regulations that Margaret claimed we were violating. She escalated to state agencies next. The Environmental Protection Agency received reports about groundwater contamination. The Agricultural Department got complaints about improper livestock management. The State Health Department was told we were operating an unlicensed dairy. None of it was true, but every agency had to investigate every complaint. Margaret organized the neighborhood against us with the skill of a political campaign manager. She created flyers about property values and distributed them door to door. She set up a petition demanding county action against dangerous agricultural operations in residential areas. She even got the local newspaper to run a story about changing land use patterns that featured a photo of our barn. The social pressure was unbearable. Neighbors who had been friendly for years started avoiding eye contact. Kids were no longer allowed to stop and look at our animals. Someone left anonymous notes in our mailbox suggesting we should sell and move somewhere more appropriate for our lifestyle. Margaret's Facebook group grew to over 200 members. Daily posts featured new photos of our property, always with captions suggesting something was wrong or dangerous. Dust cloud from ranch operations affecting air quality. Unusual activity near water well requires monitoring. Large trucks accessing agricultural facility in residential zone. My daughter came home from school crying because classmates had seen the Facebook posts. Parents were talking about the family that was causing problems in Heritage Hills. Teachers asked if everything was okay at home. The shame and embarrassment spread beyond our property line, infecting every part of our lives. The complaints became more creative and dangerous. Margaret reported us for tax violations, claiming we were operating a business without proper licensing. She contacted our insurance company with questions about liability coverage for agricultural operations. She even called the bank that held our mortgage, suggesting they should investigate whether their loan was being used for approved purposes. Each attack required a response. Each response took time, money, and emotional energy we did not have. Our savings account drained as we hired lawyers and consultants to fight accusations that should never have been taken seriously. Margaret was systematically destroying our lives with death by 1,000 cuts. The psychological warfare was constant. Margaret's daily drive-bys became bolder. She would stop directly in front of our gate, get out of her car, and take photos while staring directly at our house. Sometimes she brought friends who would point and discuss our property like we were not real people living inside. Late at night, I would stand at my kitchen window, looking out at the well that my grandfather had dug. the barn that my father had built, the pastures where 3 generations of my family had raised cattle. Everything we had worked for was under attack by someone who had lived in the neighborhood for less than 2 years. Margaret's final escalation came without warning. She appeared at my gate on a Monday morning with an official-looking document and that familiar cold smile. "This is your last chance," she announced. "I have prepared a comprehensive report about the public health dangers posed by your unregulated water supply. Groundwater contamination, bacterial risks, chemical runoff from agricultural operations. I am submitting this to every relevant agency unless you agree to shut down your operation voluntarily." I read through her report, page after page of technical-sounding accusations about water quality, environmental damage, and public safety risks. None of it was accurate, but it looked convincing. Margaret had done her homework, using scientific language and official formatting to make lies sound like legitimate concerns. "You have 48 hours to decide," she said. "Close the ranch, or I will make sure the authorities close it for you." She drove away, leaving me standing there with the document that could destroy everything my family had built. I realized that Margaret was not going to stop until she got what she wanted, and what she wanted was our complete surrender. I was feeding the horses when I heard the sirens. At first, I thought they were heading somewhere else, maybe an accident on the main road. Then I saw the red and blue lights turning through our gate, and my blood turned to ice. Fire trucks, ambulances, hazmat vehicles with flashing warning lights filled our driveway. Men in protective suits jumped out of trucks and started unloading equipment I had never seen before. Radio chatter crackled through the air while officials shouted instructions to each other. It looked like the opening scene of a disaster movie, and somehow our ranch was ground zero. My wife ran out of the house, her face white with panic. "What is happening? What did we do wrong?" I had no idea. We had done nothing different, nothing new, nothing that could possibly justify this massive emergency response. But the officials were treating our property like a contamination site, setting up barriers and warning tape around our well. A fire captain approached me with clipboard in hand and a serious expression on his face. "Are you the property owner?" "Yes, sir. What is going on?" We received a 911 call reporting immediate public health danger from contaminated water supply. Possible bacterial contamination, chemical runoff, groundwater poisoning affecting the entire neighborhood. We have to treat this as a potential emergency until we can verify the situation. My mouth went dry. Who called this in? The captain checked his paperwork. A Margaret Patterson. She provided detailed information about the contamination source and claimed immediate action was necessary to prevent widespread illness. I turned toward the street and saw Margaret standing behind the emergency vehicles, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with obvious satisfaction. She had positioned herself where she could see everything, but also where the emergency workers could see her nodding approvingly at their response. Neighbors began gathering on the sidewalk. Some looked concerned, others looked excited to finally see something happening about the ranch they had been complaining about. Kids pointed at the hazmat suits while parents whispered and took photos with their phones. Our private crisis had become public entertainment. "I need to see all your water permits, inspection records, and testing documentation immediately," the fire captain continued. "If we cannot verify safety compliance, we will have to shut down your water system pending further investigation." My hands shook as I went inside to gather the paperwork. 20 years of permits, inspections, and compliance documents scattered across my kitchen table while officials waited outside. Everything was in order, Everything was legal, but Margaret had created an emergency situation that put the burden of proof on me. The hazmat team began testing our well water while county health officials set up monitoring equipment. Every test would take time. Every delay gave Margaret more opportunity to make her case to the emergency responders and the growing crowd of neighbors. I watched through my kitchen window as Margaret approached the lead inspector, gesturing toward our property and speaking with obvious authority. She pulled out her phone and showed him photos, pointing at different areas of our ranch while he took notes. She looked like an expert providing crucial information to save the neighborhood. The preliminary tests are showing normal readings. One of the hazmat technicians told his supervisor, "No immediate contamination detected." But the supervisor shook his head. "We have to follow full protocol. The complaint alleges ongoing contamination over several months. We need comprehensive testing and complete documentation before we can clear the site." Margaret heard this exchange and immediately walked over to the supervisor. "Officer, I have been monitoring this situation for months. The contamination may not show up in simple tests. This requires deeper investigation into groundwater flow patterns and long-term exposure effects." She spoke with confidence and used technical terms that sounded authoritative. The supervisor nodded and made more notes while Margaret continued building her case. She was performing for an audience that included not just the emergency responders, but also every neighbor who had gathered to watch. "I have documentation of health complaints from residents in the area," Margaret continued, pulling out more papers. "Stomach problems, skin irritation, unusual odors in tap water. This is exactly the kind of situation that requires immediate action to prevent a public health crisis." I felt helpless watching her manipulate the situation. She had created a false emergency, but now that emergency had taken on a life of its own. The officials had to take every complaint seriously, even when the complaint came from someone with obvious motivations for making false reports. The testing continued for hours. Every sample had to be analyzed, every reading had to be recorded, every protocol had to be followed. Margaret made sure to stay visible throughout the process, positioning herself as the concerned citizen who had potentially saved the neighborhood from disaster. As the afternoon wore on, neighbors began taking sides. Some offered support, bringing me coffee and expressing disbelief at the situation. Others whispered among themselves while pointing at our property, clearly believing that where there was smoke, there must be fire. Margaret had turned our ranch into a public spectacle, and she was winning. The emergency response gave her claims an appearance of legitimacy that months of regular complaints could never achieve. She had forced the authorities to treat her accusations as credible, and now every neighbor could see official confirmation that something was wrong at our property. The fire captain approached me again as evening approached. "Sir, we are going to need to keep the water system offline pending complete analysis. Full results could take several days. We cannot risk public safety." I felt my world collapsing. Without water, we could not operate the ranch. Livestock needed constant water access. We could not function, could not survive, could not maintain the life we had built over 70 years. Margaret had won. She had used the emergency system to accomplish what months of harassment could not achieve. Our water was shut off, our ranch was crippled, and she had done it all while looking like a hero protecting the neighborhood. But she had made one critical mistake. She had no idea who she was really dealing with. The fire captain was explaining the next steps in the investigation when I made my decision. I had watched Margaret manipulate the situation for hours, building her case with confidence and authority, while officials treated her like an expert witness. But her performance was about to end. I walked calmly to my truck and retrieved my work bag from behind the front seat. Inside was my state identification, my inspection equipment, and credentials that Margaret had no idea existed. I had kept my professional life separate from ranch life for 15 years, but that separation was about to serve me well. "Captain," I said, approaching the lead inspector with my leather credential wallet in hand, "before you make any final decisions about our water system, I think you should know something important." I opened the wallet and handed him my state water inspector identification. His eyes widened as he read the official seal and my authorization number. "You are a certified water quality inspector. State-level certification, 15 years of experience, specialized training in groundwater systems and contamination assessment. I inspect water supplies across 3 counties, including municipal systems, private wells, and industrial operations." The captain's entire demeanor changed. He looked from my credentials to our well, then back to me with obvious confusion. "Sir, why did you not mention this earlier?" "Because I wanted to see how far this false emergency would go. I wanted to understand exactly what kind of accusations were being made and what evidence was being presented before revealing my qualifications." Margaret had been standing close enough to hear this exchange, and I watched her confident expression begin to crack. She moved closer, trying to hear what was happening, but the captain was now treating me as a professional colleague rather than a suspect homeowner. "What is your assessment of the contamination claims?" the captain asked. I pulled my own testing equipment from the bag and began explaining what I had observed during their investigation. "Every preliminary test has shown normal readings. The well construction meets all current safety standards. Water quality appears excellent based on visual inspection and basic testing. The contamination allegations appear to be completely unfounded." The hazmat supervisor joined our conversation, and suddenly I was discussing technical aspects of water quality assessment with fellow professionals rather than defending against accusations from an angry neighbor. Margaret stood nearby, listening to a conversation she clearly did not understand, watching her authority evaporate with every technical term. "Would you be willing to conduct an official inspection using your state equipment?" the captain asked. "That would give us the documentation we need to resolve this situation definitively." "Absolutely. I have comprehensive testing equipment in my workshop. This can be resolved within the hour with proper professional assessment." I could see Margaret's growing panic as the situation shifted beyond her control. She had created this emergency by positioning herself as the expert, but now a real expert was taking charge. Her months of research and preparation were meaningless compared to actual professional qualifications. "Wait just a minute," Margaret interrupted, pushing her way into our conversation. "This is highly irregular. He obviously has a conflict of interest. He cannot investigate his own property." The captain looked at her with new skepticism. "Ma'am, he is a state-certified inspector with proper credentials and equipment. His professional assessment would carry significant weight in determining whether any actual contamination exists. But he would obviously cover up any problems to protect his own property. This requires independent investigation by someone without personal involvement." I could hear the desperation in her voice as she realized that her carefully constructed emergency was falling apart. She had spent months building credibility through persistence and attention to detail, but professional credentials trumped amateur investigation every time. "Actually," I said, addressing Margaret directly for the first time all day, State water inspectors are required to maintain professional standards regardless of personal circumstances. Falsifying a water quality report is a felony that would result in immediate license revocation and criminal charges. I have much more to lose by providing false results than by admitting to actual problems. The captain nodded approvingly. Let us proceed with the professional assessment. That will give us definitive answers about the contamination allegations. Margaret tried one more desperate argument. This is exactly why I called for help. He has been hiding his supposed qualifications while operating this facility without proper oversight. How do we know his credentials are even legitimate? The fire captain examined my identification more carefully, then called the State Water Commission to verify my certification status. The verification took less than 5 minutes. Not only were my credentials legitimate, but my professional reputation was excellent with no history of violations or complaints. Margaret stood in stunned silence as her entire case collapsed around her. The concerned citizen who had saved the neighborhood from contamination was revealed as someone who had filed false reports against a qualified professional. The expert who had educated emergency responders about water safety had been schooled by someone with actual expertise. I began setting up my official testing equipment while the emergency crew watched with professional interest. Margaret retreated toward her car, but she could not leave without looking like she was running away from the truth she had claimed to be defending. The tables had turned completely. After months of being on the defensive, I was finally in control of the situation. And Margaret was about to discover that attacking a water quality expert with false contamination claims was the biggest mistake of her life. My official water testing equipment was more sophisticated than anything the emergency response team had brought. Professional-grade pH meters, bacterial culture systems, chemical analysis kits, and digital documentation tools that would produce reports acceptable in any court or regulatory proceeding. I began the comprehensive assessment while Margaret watched from beside her BMW, her confidence completely shattered. Every test I conducted was documented with official forms and witnessed by the fire captain. This was not just an inspection anymore. It was the creation of an official state record that would have legal implications for everyone involved. Water pH is 7.2 within optimal range, I announced, recording the results on official state forms. Bacterial count is negligible, well below safety thresholds. Nitrate levels are excellent, indicating no agricultural runoff contamination. Each positive result was another nail in the coffin of Margaret's false emergency. The hazmat team began packing their equipment as it became clear that no contamination existed. The emergency response was winding down, but my investigation was just beginning. Captain, I would like to expand this assessment to include the groundwater system for the entire area, I said. If there were legitimate contamination concerns, I should verify that no actual problems exist anywhere in the neighborhood. This suggestion sent Margaret into visible panic. She approached us quickly, trying to interrupt the expanded investigation. That is completely unnecessary. I only reported concerns about this specific property. There is no need to test other areas. But professional protocol required comprehensive assessment when contamination allegations were made. I began testing water samples from different points around the neighborhood, documenting everything with official precision. That was when I discovered something extraordinary. Margaret's own property showed clear signs of water quality violations. Captain, we have a problem, I announced after testing the runoff from Margaret's elaborate landscaping project. This property shows elevated chemical levels consistent with unpermitted fertilizer and pesticide application near groundwater sources. Margaret's face went white. That is impossible. My landscaping company handles all chemical treatments professionally. I showed the test results to the captain while explaining the regulations. Residential chemical application within 50 feet of groundwater sources requires special permits and monitoring. These chemical levels indicate ongoing violations of state environmental protection standards. The investigation expanded to include Margaret's entire property. Her elaborate landscaping included chemical-dependent grass varieties, ornamental plants that required intensive fertilization, and a sprinkler system that was clearly impacting groundwater drainage patterns. "Ma'am, do you have permits for this landscaping work?" the captain asked Margaret. "These chemical applications appear to exceed residential use standards." Margaret stammered through explanations about professional landscaping services and HOA requirements for property appearance. But none of her explanations included the permits required for chemical use near groundwater sources. I continued documenting violations, while Margaret tried desperately to minimize the significance of my findings. These are minor landscaping issues, not major contamination problems like I reported about the ranch. Actually, I explained to the captain, residential chemical violations are typically more serious than agricultural operations because residential applications are less regulated and more likely to impact neighborhood water supplies. The irony was perfect. Margaret had spent months claiming that our ranch was contaminating the neighborhood water supply, but her own property was the actual source of chemical contamination. Her false accusations had led to an investigation that exposed her own violations. More neighbors gathered as word spread about the test results. The same people who had supported Margaret's campaign against our ranch were now learning that she had been violating environmental regulation while accusing us of imaginary problems. "I am going to need documentation for all chemical applications on this property for the past 2 years," I told Margaret in my official capacity as a state inspector. "These violations will require comprehensive remediation and ongoing monitoring." Margaret's face showed pure panic as she realized the legal implications. "You cannot do this. You have a personal conflict of interest. This is harassment and retaliation." The fire captain stepped between us. "Ma'am, he is conducting an official state inspection based on evidence discovered during a legitimate emergency response. His personal circumstances do not affect his professional authority." I prepared the official documentation, while Margaret made increasingly desperate attempts to escape the consequences of her actions. She called her lawyer, her HOA president, even the county commissioner, but no one could undo the professional inspection results that were already recorded in state databases. The neighborhood dynamics shifted dramatically as residents processed what had really happened. Margaret, the self-appointed environmental protector, had been exposed as someone who violated the same environmental regulations she used to attack her neighbors. Her months of false accusations had led directly to the discovery of her own much more serious violations. Other HOA board members arrived and began distancing themselves from Margaret's actions. The board never authorized emergency calls about water contamination, the HOA treasurer announced publicly. Margaret acted independently, not as an official representative. I completed my professional report as the sun set over our ranch. The document included comprehensive water quality data showing that our well exceeded all safety standards, detailed evidence of chemical violations at Margaret's property, and official findings that her contamination allegations were completely false. This report will be filed with the State Water Commission, the County Health Department, and the Environmental Protection Agency, I explained to the assembled officials. False reporting of environmental emergencies is a serious offense that carries both civil and criminal penalties. Margaret stood beside her BMW, isolated and defeated. The neighbors who had supported her campaign were walking away, embarrassed by their association with someone who had filed false emergency reports. The emergency responders were documenting her false claims for potential prosecution. She had tried to destroy our ranch with lies about water contamination. Instead, she had exposed herself as the real environmental violator and created an official record of her deception that would follow her for years. Justice was served with professional precision and official documentation that no lawyer could dispute. The consequences for Margaret came swiftly and from multiple directions. Within a week, she received citations from the State Environmental Agency for unpermitted chemical applications, violations that carried fines totaling over $12,000. The county prosecutor opened an investigation into her false emergency report, which constituted misuse of emergency services and could result in criminal charges. Her insurance company canceled her homeowner's policy after learning about the environmental violations on her property. The landscaping company she had blamed for the chemical problems publicly stated that she had specifically requested treatments that exceeded their normal application rates, despite their warnings about environmental regulations. The HOA board held an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to remove Margaret from all leadership positions. Her role as self-appointed neighborhood enforcer ended immediately as board members scrambled to distance the organization from her actions. They issued a formal apology to our family and acknowledged that Margaret had acted without authority when she targeted our ranch. More importantly, the truth about our water quality spread throughout the neighborhood. Residents who had supported Margaret's campaign learned that they had been misled by someone who did not understand the regulations she claimed to enforce. Our ranch, which she had portrayed as an environmental threat, actually maintained higher water quality standards than most residential properties. Neighbors began stopping by to apologize for their earlier hostility. The same people who had avoided eye contact during Margaret's harassment campaign now offered genuine friendship and respect. They understood that having a professional water quality expert living in their neighborhood was actually a valuable asset, not a threat. Tom, our longtime neighbor, summed up the community sentiment perfectly. We should have known better than to trust someone who had lived here for 2 years over a family that had been good neighbors for decades. Margaret played on our fears instead of encouraging us to learn the facts. My professional reputation in the community was transformed overnight. The county commissioner asked me to serve on the Water Quality Advisory Board. The school district invited me to speak about environmental science. Local businesses began requesting water quality assessments for their operations. Margaret quietly listed her house for sale within a month. She could not afford the environmental remediation costs, the legal fees, and the ongoing fines while living in a neighborhood where everyone knew about her deception. Her perfect suburban dream ended because she could not accept that different lifestyles could coexist peacefully. The ranch returned to its peaceful routine, but with stronger community connections than ever before. Children were welcome to visit our animals again. Neighbors asked questions about sustainable agriculture and water conservation. We had become an educational resource instead of a source of complaints. I reflected often on the lessons learned during those difficult months. Patience and professional integrity had ultimately triumphed over harassment and false accusations. The legal system worked when provided with accurate information and proper documentation. Truth had power that no amount of manipulation could overcome. Most importantly, I learned that expertise carries responsibility. My knowledge of water quality regulations was not just professional qualification. It was a tool for protecting both my family and my community. Margaret's false accusations had forced me to use that expertise defensively, but the result was better protection for everyone. The ranch water still tasted perfect every morning, but now I appreciated not just its quality, but the knowledge and experience that ensured its safety for generations to come.